Hello. Today we're going to be talking about diminishing returns and increasing returns. We're going to start with a few generic questions. Is it better to take a single 2-week vacation or two different 1-week vacations? Is it better to give $1,000 to one charity or $100 to 10 different charities? Is it better to spend 1 hour studying all at once or 15 minutes apiece over 4 different days? Is it better to have many decent friends or few great friends? All of these questions have an underlying theme behind them. For a certain amount of time, effort, or resources, is it better to bunch it all together or split it apart over several different things? One thing you will have to prevent yourself from doing is making an unequal comparison. For example, you might have disliked my question about having many decent friends or few great friends. You might think, why not have a bunch of friends who are all great? I completely agree with that sentiment and would support your decision to follow that path. However, it takes time, energy, and resources to cause relationships to improve, so having many great relationships would require extra effort that violates our comparison. I won't come back and answer all of those first questions, but rather I will give you the mental framework to come back and decide for yourself based on your current situation. To help us make these decisions, we need to look and see what kind of outcome we get as we keep putting in more input. For generic cases, I'm just going to say effort, but know that time and money and many other things can be the input as well. The simplest relationship is a proportional increase. For every unit of effort you put in, you get a unit of whatever you're hoping for. When you're dealing with a proportional system, whether or not you group together or split it up is completely irrelevant. You can see what that looks like by copying the first half and then moving it over to the second half. That represents splitting your time between two different but equal things, and you can see it made no difference. An example of a proportional system is buying gas. If the gas price doesn't change from day to day, then buying 10 gallons at once will cost you the exact same amount of money as buying 1 gallon a day for 10 days. It is irrelevant. So you have to decide based on some other factor. For proportional returns, pick your favorite. To clear up one potential confusion, just because it is proportional does not mean it is good. It just means that it is predictable and the line of increase is straight. In this example, it takes 10 units of effort to get 1 unit of benefit. Whether or not that is worth it depends on how much you value the effort and how much you value the benefit. Proportional systems are great, but many things in life do not follow a straight line. The next easiest situation to understand is an increasing return system. The graph curves upward and the slope keeps increasing. That means for every extra bit of effort you put in, that bit of effort does more than the last. The steepness of the slope is the benefit to cost ratio. Early on the slopes are pretty shallow and the effort isn't as useful, but the further you go, the steeper it gets. So how do we handle situations like this? Let's duplicate the first half and find out. Hopefully, you can see that focusing all of your efforts in one go is much better than spreading it out. For example, it is possible that this graph represents your relaxation compared to time for a 2-week vacation. You might carry the stresses of work and life far into your vacation and not really get relaxed until the last few days. If this is you, then a single 2-week vacation where you actually do get completely relaxed might do you more good than two 1-week vacations that don't really do the trick. And that brings us to the principle. For increasing returns, focus your efforts. Do what it takes to get farther, since every bit of effort will make the whole thing even more worth it. Whenever you find yourself in an increasing returns situation, it is incredibly motivating. The last scenario is a bit trickier, diminishing returns. It is the opposite of increasing returns. The graph curves downward and begins to level out. That means that the first bits of effort are far more useful and steep than the later ones, and every step you continue to make gets closer and closer to useless. By this point, you can probably see where I'm going. If we copy the first half and move it up, we see that splitting our efforts over multiple identical things will be far more useful than just sticking to one. If this is how a 2-week vacation looks for you, where you wind down really quickly and then sort of just coast, you might consider taking 2 different 1-week vacations. And so, the principle is this. For diminishing returns, divide your efforts. The asterisk is there to take care of an incredibly important word I said a minute ago that you might have missed. I talked about splitting up our efforts over multiple identical things. But of course, if the multiple things are not identical, then you might need to stick it out and put all of your eggs in one basket, even though your later efforts aren't as useful. An easy example of this is cramming. Studying the day before the test and the day after the test follow the same diminishing returns curve for usefulness over time. And from an ideal long-term studying perspective, you would split up your time evenly over those 2 days. However, studying the day before the test is just fundamentally different than studying the day after the test. So putting up with the diminishing returns could be worth it. Although, I really recommend learning and studying in a way where cramming is not necessary. What you do have to watch out for is when the curve becomes completely horizontal. At that point, your efforts are completely useless, and even if that is the single most important thing in your entire life, additional work will not help you. It is also possible to have negative returns, where additional work is actually harmful, so you should also do your best to avoid this. Of course, life is rarely simple. Things do not always purely fall within one category, but you can subdivide and still make good decisions. Take a look at this graph, pause the video, and describe what you are seeing. Just like I did with the green lines earlier, where would you break this up to get the most benefit? Would you do one of the full thing, split it in 2, 3, or 4? Pause and think about it. The way I see it, the first half is an increasing return system, but then it quickly transitions over and diminishes off. I would want to maximize that increasing returns part, but then cut short of the diminishing returns section. That is this in green, and you can see that it is better than riding one out to the full course. But it is also better than dividing it into 3, since any shorter and you lose that high slope, very productive section in the middle. There's one last nuance before we get to the examples. You have to make sure not to confuse increasing and diminishing with good and bad. Think about a car. If a car goes from 0 to 10 miles an hour, its speed is increasing, but it is still slow. And if a car goes from 100 to 90 miles an hour, its speed is diminishing, but it is still fast. It is the same thing whenever you compare increasing and diminishing returns. If I have two options that look like this, of course I'm going to pick the green increasing returns. But if I have two options that look like this, I'm going to pick the diminishing returns because it is just fundamentally better at all points in time. If I have these two options, if it's something important to me and I'm thinking long term, I would pick the increasing returns. But I would do it knowing that for the first half I would be at a relative disadvantage. It would be an investment. Alright, now that we've made it through all that, we can get on to some examples. Once you train yourself to see it, these types of systems pop up everywhere in life you could imagine. Here are some non-learning examples first. If you compare the wear and tear on your engine to your oil life, or how long you drive with the same oil, you will see that it starts off fairly proportional, but at some point the oil breaks down sufficiently that you lose protection. Past that point, it is an increasing return system. In this case, since we want to avoid engine damage, we do the reverse of our principles from earlier and change the oil before the increasing returns start. The point where it turns upward is just after the manufacturer's recommendations on how often you change it, so it's worth following the directions. If you are an hourly worker, your paycheck is proportional to your hours worked, until you hit 40 hours a week where you start getting paid time and a half or double time. From a purely financial perspective, and ignoring the physical and psychological damage, it would be better to work 80 hours in 1 week and then take the next week off, because the overtime hours give you more money. From the other side of the coin, that is why most companies basically prevent anyone from working overtime. I know I'm going to offend some long-distance athletes with this, but I'm going to explain my philosophy on running. I believe the benefits of running in a single session is diminishing returns. I don't think that doubling your time from half an hour to a 1 hour run yields double the benefit. However, the wear and tear on your body is at the very least proportional, but more likely increasing returns because as you go, your running form gets worse. Based on these two things, I don't really believe in running for longer than half an hour at a time. But I do actually run for time shorter than half an hour because I think the health and wellness benefits far outweigh the wear and tear. On to learning examples. If you compare the usefulness of your knowledge to Bloom's taxonomy, I believe it looks like this. The memorization level is pretty terrible, understanding is decent, but moving from understanding to application is a huge jump. So based on today's principle, it is better to learn fewer things deeply and thoroughly than to memorize a bunch of stuff. Studying the exact same material in a single session is heavily diminishing returns. I mentioned in the studying video that keeping things in your brain requires less mental effort than remembering it from a half-forgotten state. This is the graphical version of that statement. So, following the diminishing returns principle from earlier, having a bunch of spaced out study sessions will be way more useful than a single one where you repeat all the same stuff over and over again. Of course, if you've learned a lot of things and have 4 hours worth of individual content to study, then a 4-hour study session might not be bad. But a 4-hour study session where you do 1 hour's worth of material 4 times is just not going to work. I can also show you active studying and passive studying side by side and let you decide which one is more worth your time. Lastly, we are going to look at mental effort. From the time video, we know that progress is the combination of mental effort and time. We can graph that. The white line represents 100% mental effort the whole time, and everything up and to the left is redded out because it is impossible to have more than 100% mental effort. If you spend 1 hour learning at high mental effort, it looks like this. If you spend an hour at low mental effort, it looks like this. Even though the same amount of time has passed, the differences in mental effort, which is the slope, cause a big difference in the amount of vertical progress made. But, of course, your mental effort doesn't always stay the same. You might be an increasing returns person, where it takes a bit for you to get started, but once you get going, you can put in the mental work quite well. You get to follow the increasing returns principle. Shoot for fewer but longer learning sessions to spend as much time as possible in those higher effort late stages. You might also be a diminishing returns person, where you start out strong but start to fizzle out. You have 2 options. 1, slap yourself in the face every once in a while and start putting in more effort. Mental effort is at least partly controllable, so you might just need to buckle down and focus. However, if that doesn't work, then 2, do shorter but more frequent learning sessions. Something I recommend looking into is the Pomodoro technique, where you work for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, and repeat. It is an exercise in self-restraint that keeps you from burning out over long sessions of learning or practicing a skill. However, if you normally learn like that green line, then don't kid yourself into thinking that the Pomodoro technique will help you. There's one final principle for today's video. In some situations, you have control over the graph. Things are not always completely fixed as increasing or diminishing returns. Not everything is a skeleton of a path that you just follow along. You can actually directly influence the shape of the curve based on how you approach the situation. Imagine 2 people on the opposite sides of the political spectrum talking about politics. Things might start off decent, each sharing opinions and the other person sort of listening. But what tends to happen? Anger, pride, and ego come in. The longer the conversation goes, the harder it is for either person to care about what the other person is saying. Both sides just prep their next argument while the other person is talking. You can see how this is a heavily diminishing returns scenario. Increasing their interaction time from 15 minutes to 2 hours will probably accomplish nothing. It might actually make things worse and give negative returns. But what if we start over with 2 people who are capable of swallowing their pride and come from a mindset of truly wanting to understand the other person? As one person speaks, the other person is really processing and listening. They even take the time to make sure they accurately understand the other person's position before moving on. As they make progress like this, each person feels more affirmed by the good conduct of the other person, and mutual trust is established, which allows each person to be more vulnerable and share more important things. This is now an increasing return situation. Increasing the amount of time from 15 minutes to 2 hours yields more than 8 times the results because the relationship keeps improving and the conversation gets deeper and more genuine. This entire concept is habit 5, seek to understand, then to be understood, out of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Between our 2 graphs, the scenario is exactly the same. 2 people talking about politics. But the entire shape of the graph is completely changed based on the behavior of the 2 people. You can do this too. I alluded to this when I told an entire group of people they might need to slap themselves on the face and re-engage mentally. When you come across something in your life that has diminishing returns, before you follow my first advice about splitting it up across several things, ask yourself if there is a way that you can change and cause it to be a proportional or increasing return system. Today was a long video. Thank you for sticking it out. As a random side note, the concepts we talked about today are rooted in calculus, so if you were able to follow along decently, you are one step closer to learning calculus. For the last video, we're going to talk about impacting other people's learning. Those in formal teaching roles obviously do this, but also parents, bosses, healthcare professionals, and really anyone who does much interacting with other people. I encourage you to watch it, even if you mostly only care about your own learning at this point in your life.